Over 70% of all mergers and acquisition deals are doomed to fail as per Harvard Business Review. When these deals fail, they destroy billions of dollars in value, affecting employees, companies, retirees, and communities. A significant number of these failures can be attributed to people, organization, and culture issues. This means a key to a successful M&A integration lies in addressing these people, organizational, and cultural issues before they are too late. And that is the topic of discussion today. Our guest today is Dr. Klint C. Kendrick, who has more than 20 years of experience in various leadership and HR roles. He has worked with companies like Oracle and Boeing and is regularly featured in multiple conferences across the globe. Recently, he published a book looking at people aspects related to integration. Hi, Klint. Good to see you again. Welcome to our show.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Excellent. You've got tons of years of experience in the world of mergers and acquisitions. Let's start with a bit of a background here. Share some experiences.
Sure. So I've done M&A quite a bit as a professional, but what got me started was being an employee who was affected by M&A early in my career. I've been acquired a number of times, again, mostly in my early career. Several of those times I stayed put and everything worked out for the better, but one of those times I'm that guy that walked away and took a pretty significant book of business with me when I left the new company. And I think that gave me a different perspective when I went into doing deal work full time. Done deal work now for 4 different companies in a number of different sectors, and I've worked on somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 deals over my career, all in-house as an HR leader.
That's awesome. 75 deals are quite a number.
Well, I certainly like to think that I've got some experience.
Absolutely. You being modest here, Clint. You recently wrote a book, but before we dive into the book, let's start with some of the challenges that you have experienced in M&A, especially related to people and culture.
When you look at M&A, I think most of us know the statistics that most deals don't work out. Most deals, and most is anywhere from 70 to 90%, depending on who you ask and which research you look at. And I firmly believe that a good chunk of those are due to people, culture, and leadership issues. The numbers that I've seen range to right around 25%. So that means anywhere from 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 deals don't work out because of the people issues. And I just think that you can't understate how important people are to deal value in modern businesses. It's not just machines doing things, it's human beings telling the machines what to do, even in a highly automated industry. And ignoring the people side has financial consequences.
Absolutely. And in fact, this is one space where I was talking to one of my ex-colleagues, and he was talking about that the science of M&A integration is all the checklists and all of that stuff, but the uncertainties are essentially related to people, leadership, and culture, as you pointed out. Now, you've also written a book which is on HR due diligence, and I think that's a very, very important aspect which a lot of M&A guys overlook. What was your inspiration to write this book?
Sure. So there were no books out there on how to do due diligence as an HR practitioner. I was lucky enough with a large aerospace company, nearly a decade ago, to be pulled into a role where I was taught a very solid due diligence methodology at a serial acquirer, and then learned some new things with some of the other companies that I'd worked with. And then I run a number of HRMA Roundtables, so I heard from others how they were running their diligence processes. And I said, I was lucky, right? I fell into an HR M&A role somewhere that was established, but not every practitioner is going to have that kind of luck. So let me see what I can do to help make their life a little bit easier. And so I wrote the book in a lot of ways to be a plug and play HR M&A due diligence playbook, so that an HR practitioner who's never done this before, who's been sort of thrust into it, can pick up the book and at least get a few ideas of what's going on. That's what really drove me to put all of this down on paper.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent piece of work. I've read it. I must be honest that I haven't read the entire book yet, but whatever you've written, there's tons of good information. It's a gold mine, especially for HR practitioners in that book. What would you say are some of the key elements that you've covered in your book for the benefit of the audience and the listeners?
Sure. So I tend to take a pretty logical approach and structured approach to the things that I do. And so I define due diligence in the book as really the art and science of identifying, assessing, and mitigating the people, leadership, and culture risks that arise in M&A. And so I walk step by step through how do you identify the risk? How do you assess the likelihood and impact of the risk? And then how do you mitigate the risk? And I provide a number of different risk mitigation steps inside the book. Now, the book does not go into the integration stages where I think a lot of the real work on people is done, but it does help to pave the way for practitioners to identify those areas that'll need to be addressed during integration or mitigated in some other way as they work their way through a deal.
Right. And in the world of mergers and acquisitions, it's primarily involves people from legal department,
Yeah.
from banks, from investments, from finance. How do HR get its place at the table?
It's just like anywhere else in the business. HR gets a place at the table by adding value, just like every other function. And so there are some organizations where their HR department hasn't added sufficient value for those HR folks to get a place at the table. And that's often not the fault of the HR practitioner. It's often the way the organization is set up. But I found that by speaking the language of the business, talking about the financial, the monetary impact of making some of these decisions poorly, and sometimes you got to let a leader stub their toe, right? You got to let them do something dumb, and then help rescue it, and then you get listened to a little bit more. So I wish there were always a place at the table for folks with expertise in the people, leadership, and culture area, but sometimes you have to earn that the hard way.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the bigger complaints that are there from both sides of the fence. The HR
Yeah.
communities on one side, and on the other side, the leadership often overlooking. Now, one of the things in my experience I've seen is when it comes to legal matters, risk matters, tax, and finance, it's a lot
Mhm.
more easy to quantify. And the problem is, we live in a day and an age where if we can't measure it, we'll find it difficult to manage it. And that's where the HR part often falls. How would you try and convince people to sort of navigate that subjectivity, so that quantitativeness about people and leadership?
Sure. So there's a couple of different tools in the book that help to at least put them into a systematic framework. So, I can't necessarily quantify how an employee's feeling. I certainly can do surveys and I can do engagement scores, but that's trying to take a feeling and turn it into a number, and that's always going to be an imprecise science. However, what I can do is tell you that if you look at a certain attrition rate inside an organization, that it's going to cost you X amount of dollars or euro or whatever currency you're operating in to replace that person. And so a lot of times I will look at things and say, okay, here's the current attrition rate of this organization. Here's what I think the attrition rate's probably going to do. And here's how many of your most critical people are going to walk out the door. And this is how much it's going to cost to replace them. I also try to point to some of the timeline issues that can arise when the people, leadership, and culture issues don't go well. So, if you can imagine an integration that gets delayed by 3, 6, 9, 12 months because you're missing key and critical people, there's a financial impact of that. And my job is to get as close to the financial impact as possible so that leaders understand that there are real dollars and cents involved with doing the right thing here.
Right. You've often ended up comparing an M&A with a buying of a house.
Yeah.
Let's hear that story for our listeners.
Sure, sure. So I've done that for years. I found that the house hunting analogy really resonated with people who are afraid of M&A. So, buying a company is a big deal. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of zeros in that contract. And most HR professionals that I've met have a really hard time feeling comfortable operating inside something that's got that level of magnitude. So I started years ago saying, look, it's very similar to the process of buying a home. So your target selection process is very much like house hunting. Your brokers and advisors are very similar to your real estate agents. Your bankers are like your mortgage person. Due diligence is like your home inspection. And both of them will often have a period between sign and close where you're doing a lot of planning. In a acquisition, you're trying to figure out how to integrate these two organizations. When you're buying a home, You may be deciding to remodel, or you may simply be deciding where the furniture goes, depending on how ready the house is for you to move in. And then hopefully things settle down and you just go on to live a happy, peaceful, comfortable life. So by taking those examples, the house hunting, and mapping it onto our M&A process, I find that people can relate a little bit better to what's going on.
Yeah, that's an excellent analogy with buying a house and acquiring a company. You talked about due diligence. I mean, in fact, that's the topic of your book, HR Due Diligence. A lot of people who come from an operational background may not be familiar with the intricacies of a due diligence. Maybe you could throw some light on what does due diligence mean from an HR angle.
When I look at the due diligence from an HR perspective, I usually look at risk. I walk in with the assumption that the deal team, the corporate development, or whoever the folks are that are running the financial aspects of the deal, they have a good idea of what's going on with this business. Now, that's not always the case, I've learned, but I like that as a going in assumption. Sometimes it's just an attractive target and you're going to go for it, right? But I assume most of the time there's an actual plan that's fairly well thought out. And so my job is to look at, okay, where are those people, leadership, and culture risks? And I put them into 6 different buckets. So I start off by looking at financial risk, which is any risk that's going to have a direct material impact on the organization's finances. And that's because, like we alluded to earlier, I really want people getting into the dollars and cents of it. That's the easiest thing for people to understand. The next place I look at is operational risks. And operations in most organizations rely very heavily on the people. And understanding what those operational risks are is really critical. Then there's compliance risk. So this is anything where you might end up with government fines or penalties that will harm the organization's reputation or the finances. Those are the 3 areas that I consider the sort of hard numbers, the financial, operational, compliance. Most leaders will be right on board with those. And the other 3 areas are more what I call soft risks. So it's the leadership risk, it's the culture risk. And when I look at leadership, I'm talking about who's going to provide direction to the overall organization. Culture risk is really about changing the way that they do business, looking at the different processes that they have, the procedures, and how they use those processes, those policies, those procedures to deliver value to their customers. And then finally, we've got to look after the HR function. So we're looking after the whole deal, and then we also have to look after our own, and that HR functional risk is the 6th risk area. So I think that by looking at those 6 risk areas and assessing the deal through that lens can really help the HR practitioner or really any integration professional understand how the people are going to come to play in this deal and what you're going to need to do to manage them. And let me give it just a quick example. So I think financial risk is pretty straightforward, right? You've got some sort of fines that are imposed. You're looking at things like your payroll costs. You're looking at pension costs, those sorts of things. On the operational side, I did a deal a couple of years ago where the company, their recruiting was to go to the local community college. And they brought in people to come work for them for a period of 2 to 3 years while they were waiting for other jobs. And their process was to pick up the phone and they would call that community college and say, hey, I need 1 or 2 of your best students who are looking for an opportunity. Can they start Monday? And they had no problem filling their talent pipeline that way. Well, I was with a big company at the time, and our hiring process was just a little different. You had to post the requisition. The requisition had to be up for at least 5 days. Usually it was up for 2 or 3 weeks. And right there, we've already doubled, tripled, quadrupled the amount of time that it took them to hire. But we weren't done yet. We now had to go through at least 3 interviews, right? To interview at least 3 people, and they had to be interviewed multiple times. And then we extended the offer. And then there was a wait time while they went through background checks, et cetera. And so the time to hire in this acquisition went from roughly 2 to 3 days to 2 to 3 months. And that had a significant impact on operations. And I'll never forget, the leader of that deal called me and said, why is it taking so long for me to hire people? And I said, well, I highlighted it in my due diligence report, and I even provided you some mitigations and suggested maybe we should drop some requisitions as soon as the deal closes so you can get a talent pipeline going on. And, would you like me to start doing that now? So it was a little bit of a professional I told you so, but that was an operational risk from not having enough people on board to deliver the value that that acquisition was supposed to deliver. Compliance risk, pretty straightforward. In the United States, it's things like the Fair Labor Standards Act, which governs overtime payments. There are also some risks if you're doing layoffs. A lot of countries prohibit layoffs or manage the way layoffs are done if people synergies are part of the deal value. Leadership risk, I think we've all seen situations where a leader just isn't ready to move through the acquisition. And unfortunately, a lot of times I see leaders who've checked out, right? They've made their millions of dollars and they really aren't interested anymore. They'll stick around, but they're not really leading anymore. Or the leader has such a difficult time integrating culturally into the new organizational dynamic that they're just unsuccessful. And I think we've all seen how that can destroy deal value. Culture risks, to me, that's both about the processes as well as the change agility of the organization. And I think one of the big myths out there is that small organizations are more agile. And I have just learned over time that that's simply not true. A lot of those organizations were built around certain sets of tools. When I was with my last company, we didn't use Slack, for example, very popular collaboration tool. A lot of the small companies that we bought were using Slack. And so we would sunset Slack because we did a full integration model and that technology was not part of what we were using at the time. And people lost their minds because they had to move to email instead of Slack. And so that was a big cultural thing. It was how they communicated with one another. And we took that away. And all of a sudden, these small organizations went from being, really agile to really needing to find their feet. And then finally, the HR function and the number of times that HR practitioners from the sell side and HR practitioners from the buy side don't necessarily get along, or honestly, HR is often the first casualty along with other back office folks of this. So sometimes we just lose them altogether and we have to figure out how to support those employees. So just some examples of where those risks might show up in the real world.
Those are great examples that you shared. Thanks for that. A couple of areas where I've seen, especially from an HR and a leadership angle, where organizations have struggled. One of them is succession planning. The second one is talent development and top talent management. And the third one is retention. I would like to hear your opinion on those. Now, on the succession planning, the thing that I've seen is majority of the companies either don't have a good succession plan in place, or even if they do, it's always the first degree. So which means that here is a layer, here is their succession plan. But often what happens is these people, if they move to this job, what happens to this particular job they were doing in the past, right? What's your take? How should organizations manage that second degree succession planning?
And that's not just small organizations. I've seen that with big corporations that I've worked for as well, where they'll think 1, 2, 3 clicks below the CEO, but they won't think about their directors and managers, and will often leave that to the department heads to sort out. But they don't really have great tools to work their way through the succession plan. So that's not just limited to those small companies. I think when you get into an M&A situation, I will often ask for the succession plans. I won't always get them because a lot of organizations don't have them, but I'll look at that and I will tie that into the way that we look at retention, or at least allude to it when we're looking at doing comp and ben alignment. So for those that haven't been through the people side, if you're doing anything really other than a standalone, if you're doing some level of integration, there's usually some alignment into the buyer's pay structure. And so that often happens through a conversation with the target company managers. Usually that's the same time when you talk about bonuses, when you talk about equity, when you talk about their different roles and responsibilities. And I think one of the most critical questions that you can ask during that alignment process, which usually happens after the deal is announced, that when you're going through that process, you want to ask, who are the next leaders in this organization? And try to really understand that and motivate those folks to stick around. The succession planning isn't always formalized, but I do find that really good managers have at least thought about it. Right? What happens if my lead leaves? How am I intentionally developing that person to take on what's next? And that I find is usually taken out of a conversation post-announce. And I do think it dovetails into the retention conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, often use the details of succession planning or the richness of succession planning on the skills of the HR and the leadership of that organization by looking at how evolved or how detailed the succession planning is. You can figure out how much of discussions have been taking place in that organization and how much involvement does the leadership and HR have.
Yeah, it's what's really interesting to me is that I can often tell when a target company's leadership team has a few people from bigger organizations with more structured methodologies around people management, and those folks who have always been with organizations under about 500 people. Because there's usually a very different approach to the succession planning. Usually, when you've got a leader that's been with a large organization that has some structure, they tend to adopt that. It's just what they were trained to do. Where those folks have been a little bit scrappier in their careers, they're thinking about it, they're just not formalizing it. And then some just don't think about it at all, right? They're so busy building their business, and a lot of them seem to experience pretty high turnover in the early years. And those are the places where I tend to find it the most challenging. And that's where I think the buyer really needs to mitigate that leadership risk by making sure that they either can hire that talent really quickly, they feel like their talent machine can gear up fast enough, or that buyer feels like they have people that they can plug directly in to help run that business if a lot of those folks leave.
Moving on to the retention, one of the things that I've seen companies that have a certain guideline on what the retention should be versus companies that are based on favorites of the managers. Like, I would like to keep that person, but this person can go. What should people be looking at, when it comes to retention? What are some of the tips and tricks of doing a robust retention plan?
So I don't think you're ever going to get away from the manager's favorites. I just think that that's very much human nature, and that those managers are going to look at those people that they get along best with and are going to want to promote them. They're going to want to reward them. And when the M&A deal comes down and it feels like there's maybe a little bit more money to be handed out, that dynamic continues. I think it's contingent upon whoever is doing the retention planning, whether that's happening. Sometimes I'll see retention in the LOI, right? It'll be, we're going to keep your top leaders and we're going to dedicate X amount of budget. And HR is not always included in that. So whoever's doing that, whether it's HR later in the process or it's the corp dev team at the LOI stage, somebody needs to be asking critical questions about that person's background, about what that person will be doing. And so I really believe that creating I call it a leader dossier, where you sit down and you look at what that leader brings to the table, and really try to understand what's their history, what's their future capability when you're making those retention decisions, can make an enormous difference. Now, when you go down a couple of clicks into the organization, like what you're talking about, a lot of times that happens again after the transaction's been announced. It's usually a conversation that includes sometimes the deal sponsor, sometimes the integration leader and the HR team, that it's really a very similar approach. Now, I'm not going to create a dossier for every employee in the company. It's too much work. It's ineffective. But I can at least ask questions. What is this person's potential? Tell me about their performance. Or, gosh, I've got these two people with very similar job titles. What differentiates them? And that's where I can listen for, we go golfing every Saturday, and that's why I like them, versus somebody's a really solid performer and they're helping the business out. There is another tool that I've not used a lot myself, but the folks that have used it find it really successful. And that's working with organizational network analysis, where you really look at those connections inside the organization and you can see where the information flows and moves around and who your really critical influencers in the organization are. And the times that I've been able to do some O&A work, organization network analysis work, have been really interesting. Sometimes the manager's perceptions of, who moves the most information around or who really are the cultural influencers are spot on, and other times they're really quite off.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point that you brought up there. It's the movers and shakers in the organization. Some of them are kingmakers. some of them are strong influencers, and that's where many times, if you haven't done your organizational due diligence properly, you have a chance of missing those out. Because literally, especially from a leaders of a relatively smaller company, they may not be forthcoming with that piece of information.
Yeah.
This is also the influencers are also often tribal leaders, where they house the tribal knowledge. So how do you make sure that you're able to capture that piece of information, and make sure that that doesn't pose a risk to an integration?
Yeah. So I think you have to be aware and listen. One of the things that I recommend in the book, and one of the practices that I picked up after making a massive mistake early in my career, was the post diligence huddle. And the basic idea behind the post diligence huddle is that you're pulling together everybody that was on your due diligence team, whether that person sat in HR or is one of your corporate development people, your IT, your finance, your procurement, your technology. Like, the whole diligence team gets together and answers two questions. The first question is really about how are we going to break this business when we do the integration, right? We have a sense of our integration model. How are we going to break this business if we pull them into the way that we do things? And the second question is really about who we should keep on board. Who do we need to put some additional time and attention into retaining? So I find that the post diligence huddle is really helpful for getting the entire diligence team on board with the culture and retention pieces. And it stuns me how many organizations don't do that. The due diligence happens in silos, and everybody has their own report, but nobody talks to each other. And like I mentioned, I made a phenomenal mistake early in my career because of that. We were buying a tech company when I was with a manufacturer, and it turned out the guy who'd written all of the source code was known by IT, but I didn't uncover him in my diligence process. And I didn't talk to IT, didn't ask them the questions. And when we came to announce the deal, the guy that had written all the source code was upset. And upset is putting it mildly. So not only was he a technology leader, but he was also a leader inside the culture. And him being upset caused problems. So we had to scrounge at the last minute and put together a retention package for this guy. And that is not the way to do retention. It's like, oh, we forgot you, but here you go. Here's your retention offer. That only goes so far to soothe hurt feelings. And so I introduced that practice of the post diligence huddle in that organization, and it made all of the difference. We started to catch some of those movers and shakers, as you call them. The other thing that I recommend, and I think this is also often overlooked, is take a look at the office assistant, whether that's a front desk person or whether that's an executive assistant to the CEO, or I often call them the office mom, because she's usually the glue that holds small organizations together. And getting friendly with whoever the office mom is makes an enormous difference, because they usually know a lot more than we give them credit for. And just having a few of those conversations, and when we're allowed to do site visits, when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, watching how they interact with people and who comes to them and how information moves can be really helpful in also determining those movers and shakers.
I think that's a great insight. The office mom, the executive assistant to the CEO, great source of information. Sometimes even the receptionist, sometimes
Yeah.
the office boys, especially in the emerging market, they can be great source of information. You're absolutely spot on. Great insight. Now, looking at talent development, and this is something you and we have spoken on a number of occasions. Talent development, like succession planning, tends to be a stronghold of the upper echelon, whereas the middle management, the frontline management often lose out because it doesn't cascade. How do we ensure that if there are talent development programs that the middle management or the frontline workers were part of are not diluted when they join a new organization?
This again is another area where large organizations, I don't think, do any better than smaller organizations. I was doing some research recently. In fact, I think it was for one of your roundtables where I was talking about leaders and leader development. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was well over 80% of people managers have never been trained in how to manage a team. So they're sort of thrust into the job, and it makes it very, very difficult for them to go manage, to go lead. And I don't think small organizations are any better off than large organizations in this case. So I think it really boils down to how that company does things, what's the culture, and understanding where the gap is. And if the acquirer has a better way of doing development for those individuals, either at the front line or in the middle, then great, pull them into your system. But quite candidly, my experience is that even large organizations really do a poor job of developing their talent in the middle and at the bottom of the organization. I wish I had a better answer for you, but often you're in a situation where you're going from a poor training and development culture to another poor training and development culture. My take on it as a guy who spent 25 years in HR, this is where the quality of your management team makes an enormous difference. So if you have a manager who's worried about developing their people and actively working on that, it doesn't matter the size of the organization. Those team members are usually going to do better. They're usually going to stay longer, and they're usually going to add more value than the employees of managers that don't value that kind of development.
Absolutely. And thanks, Clint, for bringing that one up. There is a gap in the way we have done integrations in the past. Things are getting a lot better, I must say, compared to some of the integrations that took place 20 years back or even 15 years back. One of the challenge that some of these vital elements get missed out. How do you manage that during a due diligence?
So I think this is where the heat chart comes in. It's a very common project management tool. It's not known to a lot of HR people. So I introduce it in my book as, I think, one of the best ways of determining what items you're really going to pay attention to. And for those who aren't familiar with the heat chart, or it's also called a risk impact matrix, there's a bunch of different names for it. But it's essentially a tool that exists on two axes. And on one axis, you're looking at what's the risk of this thing happening or not happening, as the case may be. How likely is it usually on a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 4 scale? And then on the other axis, you're looking at the impact. How big a deal is this going to be? And I usually look at that impact as impact on integration and impact on operations. Because some things that'll impact the integration won't matter in the long term, but they make a big difference to the integration. And some things that'll impact operations will remain hidden for a period of time until they suddenly rise up after the integration is complete. So I really think that by looking at those things that are more likely to happen and are going to have a bigger impact on either the integration or the operation of the business, not only the HR practitioner, but the entire deal team and integration team can understand those places where they need to focus. And then the other things that come up will either not be important enough that you really need to deal with them until they arise, or they'll just sort of be swept along with the currents of the deal. But that risk impact matrix and looking at those things that show up in the high likelihood of happening and the high impact if they do happen, that really can provide an opportunity to focus on those critical few areas.
Thanks for sharing that. Another piece of very good insight. As we look into the future, which is going to be visible in the coming decade, is that the baby boomers are already getting into the retirement. Gen Y, many of us are going to be looking at retirement. Whereas millennials and Gen Z are getting into the workforce, and if you look at orientation that these different generations have, loyalty versus attraction of the content of the job for the millennials and Gen Z, how do we ensure that we are able to incorporate employee experience as one of the elements in due diligence going forward?
This is where I always find things really interesting. That large corporations ask for loyalty, but they don't give loyalty back, and so it's absolutely unreasonable to ask somebody to be loyal to you when you're not loyal to them. So those organizations that have a history of doing things like GE was famous for when I was growing up, which is we're just going to cut the bottom 10% and then wonder why people don't stick around. It's like, well, loyalty is a reciprocal thing, right? I'm not going to be loyal to you if you're not going to be loyal to me. And my kid grew up in an era where loyalty was never a thing. My kids are both millennials and Gen Z. They sort of straddle that generational divide. They're much more likely to look at almost a gig economy way of looking at things, whether it's a series of short-term projects or staying with an employer for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I think that the days of 20 years and a gold watch, not only are they over now, but they've been over for years, and nobody's living that life. So I think companies that are run by boomers or some of the older Gen Xers are really trapped in a paradigm that just no longer exists. And you need to run your business and your integration plans with an expectation that if you treat an employee well, they're going to stick around for 4 or 5 years. And if you get lucky, they'll stick around for longer. But you have no reasonable expectation that an employee is going to stick around for longer. And you really need to look at developing people in such a way that they want to stick around, that they've got opportunities in your organization that make it feel like it's that new job experience that they want, that new challenge, because they're just not going to be happy to stay stuck for a few years in the same job, doing the same thing over and over and over again. Now, there again, these are generalities, right? You'll find some people that are more than happy to park for 20, 30 years and then retire out of the organization, but that's certainly the exception to the rule. I think when we look at M&A, I think it's really important to understand that if somebody's been with the same company for 5, 10 years, and you're looking at them as being a critical player in either the integration or the ongoing operations, that the buyer has to incentivize those people to want to stick around. And I think that there are ways to do that that are fairly expensive, right? I can promise you a bonus for sticking around for a couple of years, or I can give you stock options or RSUs or, a phantom equity plan that vests over time so that I've got some financial hooks in you. And those are effective to a point. But just realize that if somebody's going to recruit them out, that signing bonuses exist to make up for lost future opportunities. So I think the non-financial incentives are just as important if you want somebody to stick around for a longer period of time. And that can be anything ranging from a special project that they want to work on, or helping to pay for their next level of education, giving them a larger team. Some entrepreneurs, some of the leaders at the top, the founders, they'll stick around out of a sense of loyalty to their people and allowing them a certain level of control over their piece of the business can be some of that non-financial incentive. So I do think people on the integration and the deal side really need to understand that you only got so much time with these folks. If you want them to stick around, you're going to have to work for it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned gig economy. I think that's going to play a very critical role. What's your take? Are organizations shaping up well to handle gig economy going into the near future?
I think it depends on the organization. I've seen a lot of larger legacy companies that a lot of them just don't like to use contractors. They want to use full-time people in-house, or they want to outsource entire functions like the facilities or cleaning crew. Seen outsourced IT, I've seen outsourced HR, but usually they do that as a whole function, and they'll occasionally bring in hired guns as experts. But I don't think they're as facile with it as some of the smaller organizations I've seen that are really better designed for flexible working arrangements where somebody can come in 2, 3 days a week or come in for a 3 to 6 month project. I do think it's an area that presents some risk right now because our legislation and regulations have simply not caught up with the business reality of gig workers. So I think we're at a real inflection point right now with the gig economy. And I think we have yet to see how that's going to play out. But I personally don't think it's going away. I don't think we see regulators and legislators really wanting to make that part of the economy disappear because it's so large and robust. But I do think we're going to see more regulations on it. And here in the US, that has some significant compliance risks. So, both from a taxation and a workers' compensation insurance perspective, those, I usually see it with startups, but those startups that have relied very heavily on gig workers can have some real problems with their compliance around how those folks are working in their companies. So I'm hoping that gets sorted out in the next few years, that the tax consequences, the workers' comp consequences get managed. But I think we're in a still really nebulous spot with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the jury's still out of what's going to happen in the gig economy, especially, it is going to pose a question for acquirers buying smaller companies for sure. As we move towards the end of our interview, just time for a couple of more questions. First one, the whole conversation started with your book. What are a couple of things that make it attractive for people to read?
Sure. So I really think the book will add value to folks that are trying to strengthen their HR due diligence process. I try to put templates in there. I tried to put some tools in there, provide some real examples, both from myself and from members of our roundtables. So I think that it's a really user-friendly way to look at your due diligence process. I also took the first, I think it's the first 3 chapters, and provide an introduction to M&A, trying to put it in layman's terms, trying to put it through an HR lens. And I think that just getting comfortable with the way that the M&A process works and looks can be a real benefit to people who are nervous about stepping out on this journey. So I really tried to make this something that would be valuable for anybody who picks it up and reads it, because I think that there's a lot of great insight, and not all of them are mine. That's the other thing I like to really point out, is that as a leader in our community of HR M&A practitioners, that I've got the wisdom of literally thousands of deals and a lot of conversations about what can go right and what can go wrong baked into the stories that are inside the book.
The thing that you mentioned about the wisdom, the collective wisdom, or the wisdom that we collect from other practitioners, I think that's really powerful. Like, you can't have experience of 1,000 M&As, but you can definitely have a network of 1,000 M&A practitioners from whom you can learn. And that kind of brings me to literally the last question: HR M&A Roundtable. What is that? How do people join that roundtable?
So the HR M&A Roundtable is an organization I started about 4 years ago, and it was really designed to bring HR M&A practitioners together. And it's actually grown beyond just HR people. We actually have quite a few integration leaders, corp dev leaders that come to participate in our roundtable sessions. And it's a group that's limited to people that are actively working on M&A transactions or expect to in the next 12 months. So everybody who comes really has a vested interest in the M&A work that we do. We provide monthly roundtable sessions where we'll pick a topic and we'll have somebody who's really knowledgeable about that topic lead a roughly hour-long conversation about it. We also host an annual conference. We'll actually be opening up registration for our 2021 conference very soon. That conference this year will be virtual. And it's 3 days with really, really great people who understand how M&A works, talking about all of those people, culture, and leadership topics that go on. We're also in the process of developing a due diligence toolkit. So in addition to the book, if somebody wants sort of due diligence in a box, that'll be something that we have available. And then finally, we're going to start offering training soon. And so our real goal is to elevate the practice of HR M&A and to help people who are going through the M&A process really learn how they can shape that in such a way that the deals become as successful as possible. Our website is mandaroundtable.com, and you have to spell out the and, right? Because our web browsers don't like the ampersand. So mandaroundtable.com is how that's spelled. And I'm an open networker on LinkedIn. So anybody who wants to find me there is welcome to send a connection. And I do my best to keep up with messages.
What we'll do is, for our viewers and listeners, we're going to put the list of the URLs, the links, in our description box. And we'll also put your LinkedIn ID so that people can connect. And then, of course, last but not least, your book that's available globally through Amazon and some of the other bookstores.
Absolutely. It's out on Amazon. It's also available as a Kindle edition. So anybody who wants the book is, just surf on out to Amazon and you can find it there.
Absolutely. And if somebody wants a signed copy of Klint, then you know how to reach out to him. Connect through LinkedIn. And I'm sure he would love to have a conversation with you. Any final thoughts before we close the session?
I just really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about the people aspects. I think so often our due diligence processes really get boiled down to things that can show up on a spreadsheet. And not all of our people items can show, you can't stick it in Excel. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to help elevate the conversation about how people and the people side of M&A can make a difference.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking our time and doing this conversation with me at this stage.
Great. Thank you.
So this was an episode related to M&A integration and M&A due diligence with Klint Kendrick, one of the most well-recognized industry leaders related to HR in M&A. If you like this episode, then don't forget to press the like button. And if you would like to continue hearing more interviews in the future, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Till the next time, when we bring you yet another great speaker, I wish you guys a great week ahead and have fun. Bye-bye.